A new chapter in the legal battle between Sofia Vergara and her former fiancé over the fate of their frozen embryos. A right-to-live lawsuit has been filed on behalf of the embryos, the fertilized eggs in the state of Louisiana. The suit asking for the embryos to be given to Vergara's ex, Nick Loeb, who wants to have them carried to term by a surrogate. But Vergara is arguing that a contract signed by both parties prevents the use of the embryos without the consent of the other person. There's a lot here. Let's bring in our legal panel. Anahita Sadagatvar is a criminal defense attorney, and Yodit Tewolde is a former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney. We love them for their expertise, but they hands down have the best names of anybody that we have in the program. So it's great to have
Thanks,
you both.
Jenna.
And that is a simple explanation as best we could, because it is a little bit of a complicated case. Can an embryo file a lawsuit?
That's the question, and this is definitely groundbreaking, Jenna, like you said. But in the state of Louisiana, frozen embryos do have certain legal protections, and yes, they can be named as parties in a lawsuit. And remember, this case is extremely different from the prior lawsuit that Nick filed in California seeking custody, because the frozen embryos are the plaintiffs here. And the theory, like you said, is right to life. The argument is that these frozen embryos have an inherent right to live, and if they're not brought to term, they will be deprived from the benefits of a trust that was set up for them. So, in my opinion, this is really sort of a roundabout way that Nick Loeb is trying to seek custody of those embryos, since he was forced to drop the case in California.
And why was he forced to drop the case in California, Yodit?
You know what? There was a deposition that Vergara's attorneys wanted to have, interviewing the two, I guess, prior girlfriends that Nick Loeb had in the past that he claimed had abortions. He didn't want to have them, exposed to the scrutiny of being questioned under, I guess, such a sensitive situation. So he ended up just dropping the case altogether because he didn't want to put these two former girlfriends basically under a deposition. So, I don't even really understand why this whole thing is even happening in Louisiana, though, Jenna, if you really want to be frank. This whole thing has nothing to do with being pro-life, pro-choice. What it has to do with is contracts law. They had an agreement, regardless of whether it was made in California or not. They had an agreement that said that neither of them could use the embryos without the consent of the other. So Sofia Vergara is making the argument that, look, I made the decision to have kids with someone I thought I was going to marry. So we made that decision together, and we also need to make the decision to go further in the process of these embryos together as well, and not one or the other.
And interesting. So Anahita, Nick says that, Nick Loeb says that is the case, that there was a contract, but that the contract did not stipulate what would happen if they broke up. The contract was about them being together, and if one decided not to move forward, then the other one wouldn't as well. But it didn't stipulate, okay, if we're not talking anymore, this is what's going to happen. Is that an opening for Nick Loeb in this case?
Arguably, yes, that is an opening, and I think that speaks to the moral of the story, and that is times are changing, and more people are freezing embryos, they are freezing sperm, they are freezing eggs, and these couples really need to sit down, have these discussions, and put everything in writing. They need to decide what happens if we split up or get a divorce, what happens if one of us dies, what happens if one of us falls ill, because ultimately, like Yodit said, at least in most jurisdictions, this is a matter of contract law, and the judges generally like to look at the intent of the parties and what the parties contemplated. That's the starting point. Now, we've seen in some states when there are openings, such as in this particular case, where judges will try to, put in their own determination as to what is to happen. But if the contracts are solid and these couples discuss these issues beforehand, it will avoid all of this court intervention.
And Yodit, just a quick final thought from you. If you're Sofia Vergara and you're handling this onslaught of press about this potential case, what's the strategy from her team? How do you approach this?
To rely on the contract, and it's to convince the court, because now they have to interpret this contract that didn't take into consideration whether the couple was going to last or not. So the couple even, took into the consideration whether one of them would die or not, and what would happen to the embryos. They didn't consider, hey, what if we actually made the decision not to be together? So that's where the court comes in. They've got to interpret what was happening at the time this agreement was made, and that's where you make the argument from Sofia Vergara's side that, look, I made the decision want to have a child or children with someone I thought I was going to marry. We were engaged. I no longer want to have kids with somebody who's now my history, a part of my history. I'm moved on, and I'm married to someone else, and that's who I'd want to have kids with. So you have to make that argument and make the court understand where she was mentally when she was making this, this contract.
The information we have, she doesn't want to destroy the embryos. She wants to keep them indefinitely, and that's what Nick Loeb is arguing against. Yodit and Anahita, it's great to have you both. Thank you very much. We'll be right back.
Thanks, Jenna.
Thank you, Jenna.